Okay, so today I want to discuss what I think is the single most dangerous question in the world right now. What happens if the United States actually invades Iran on the ground? Not more bombing, not another aircraft carrier, not another White House statement full of words like deterrence, stability, and decisive action. I mean, American ground troops moving into Iran in force and trying to take and hold territory. Because right now, as we speak, Donald Trump has just stood in front of the American people and said that thanks to the progress America has made, the United States is on track to complete all of its military objectives very shortly. He said Iran will be hit extremely hard over the next 2 to 3 weeks. He said America is winning. He said they are going to hit Iran so hard they will send it back to the Stone Ages. And whenever a leader starts talking like that, I pay closer attention, not less. Because when a country is truly winning, it usually does not need to keep repeating that it is winning. And at the very same time, Peter Hegseth is talking about something much larger than Iran. He is talking about a greater North America strategy, a security perimeter stretching from Greenland to the Panama Canal, from Alaska down toward Venezuela. So now you have to ask yourself a very strange question. Why is a country that is already fighting a war with Iran and not cleanly finishing it also talking like a continental power, trying to redraw its whole strategic space at the same time? Why Greenland? Why the Panama Canal? Why Canada, Mexico, Venezuela? Why this language of perimeter control, consolidation, and self-sufficiency while a major Middle East war is still unresolved? People look at this and say Trump is chaotic, he is reckless, he is impulsive, he is simply hitting everything he can reach. I want to argue something much more dangerous than that. I think there is a plan, not a humane plan, not a moral plan, not necessarily a successful plan, but a plan. And if you do not understand that plan, then you are going to misunderstand not only what a ground invasion of Iran would look like, but what kind of transformation some people around Trump may now believe America has to force on itself and on the world. But first, let us deal with the military question, because that is what everybody is asking. If the United States actually invades Iran on the ground, what happens? The first answer is not ideological. The first answer is geographic. Iran is a nightmare battlefield for an invading army. And I do not say that for dramatic effect. I say it because you can see it on the map. Iran is huge, roughly 4 times the size of Iraq. Around 90 million people, a country with internal depth, difficult terrain, long distances, mountain barriers, desert approaches, and very few easy roads to the political heart of the state. If America attacks from Iraq, which is the obvious route everyone imagines first, then the Americans run straight into the Zagros Mountains. Those mountains are not a detail in the story. They are the story. They are the story. They are exactly the kind of terrain where a defender can hide, wait, strike, relocate, and make every mile of the invasion more expensive. If America tries to come from the east, through the Pakistan side, the problem changes, but it does not improve. Now, the issue is distance, exposure, desert movement, and the simple fact that Tehran is still very far away. If the attack comes from the south, from the Gulf, America still does not get an easy war. There's still rough interior approaches. There's still long lines of supply. There is still a defender that has spent decades planning for exactly this possibility. So before you even get to politics, before you even get to ideology, before you even get to the economy, the map already tells you this would be one of the most difficult major military operations the United States could possibly attempt. And then the troop math makes it worse. America has around 50,000 troops in the Middle East right now. People hear that number and think it sounds large. It is not large for this mission. If the mission is not just to raid, not just to punish, not just to destroy facilities from the air, but to conquer and hold Iran, then 50,000 troops is not the number. 100,000 is not the number. 200,000 is not the number. Even 300,000 is not the number if you're talking about truly occupying and stabilizing a country this large with this population and this terrain. You are talking about something in the range of 3 to 4 million soldiers. America's entire active military is only around 1.3 million. So the math is not just unfavorable. The math is absurd. The publicly imagined war and the real manpower requirement do not even exist in the same reality. And yet, despite all of that, there are already signs that some form of larger preparation may be underway. We have seen reserve language telling military personnel to be ready to deploy, fight, and win. We have seen prediction markets where real money has moved toward the invasion scenario. In one case, a very large bet reportedly went in on the idea that a U.S. ground invasion of Iran would happen with a payout far above the original stake if it does. And then there are the strange little signals that sound funny until you realize they keep showing up around Washington before major operations. Pentagon overtime, pizza delivery surging, the whole ecosystem around the national security bureaucracy starting to behave like people are preparing for something larger than the public has officially been told. And if that proves a ground invasion is coming, but no, it is nothing either. So let us use game theory and push the sequence forward. Suppose the United States actually does it. Suppose American ground troops enter Iran. What happens next? The first thing that happens is that television lies for a little while. There will be maps. There will be retired generals drawing arrows. There will be a short window where the campaign may look manageable. Some territory may be taken. Some fixed targets may be destroyed. News anchors will say things like momentum, progress, and operational success. And for a week or two, perhaps a little longer, the visual story could favor Washington. That is always the deceptive phase, because Iran has not been preparing for a ground invasion for 5 years. Iran has not been preparing for a ground invasion for 10 years. Iran has been preparing for this for 25 years. Underground bases in mountain terrain, missile stockpiles, drone stockpiles, hard to find logistics hubs, defensive systems designed specifically to kill helicopters, armor, convoys, and expose supply lines in exactly the kind of geography the Americans would have to cross. And remember something very important in the current air war. Iran appears to have used only part of its underground military depth, not everything, one cluster of buried capability, not the whole system. So a ground invasion would not begin against a country that has already shown its full hand. It would begin against a country that has been holding painful assets in reserve for the moment. The war becomes slower, closer, and far more dependent on vulnerable logistics, so the Americans go in. At first it looks manageable, then reality arrives, the mountain starts slowing everything down, the distances start stretching supply lines, drones start hitting American convoys, every helicopter becomes a risk, every fuel truck becomes a target. Every ammunition shipment becomes a vulnerability, every supply ship in the Gulf becomes part of the battlefield. And that is the moment the war turns from an operation into a trap. This is the pattern America has seen before. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq after the initial invasion. America is very good at the opening blow. It is the war after the opening blow that ruins them. Iran has studied that pattern for years. They know the weakness is not that America lacks firepower. The weakness is that America loses control when the war becomes long, expensive, ugly, and psychologically exhausting. So that is stage one, the military trap. Then comes stage two, the economic trap, because the moment America launches a real ground invasion, Iran has every incentive to widen the cost of the war far beyond the battlefield. And the most obvious place to do that is the Strait of Hormuz. Most people hear Hormuz and think oil. Yes, oil is the first layer. And if Iran decides the war has become existential, then mining the strait, striking tankers, and attacking Gulf energy infrastructure all become rational defensive escalation from Tehran's point of view. Iran has already made it very clear that pushing oil toward $200 a barrel is part of the logic of escalation, but the story does not stop at oil. This is the part a lot of people are still not thinking through carefully enough. The wider Gulf system moves much more than crude. Fertilizer inputs like phosphate, ammonium, sulfur, and urea matter enormously interrupt those flows, and this stops being just a fuel story. It becomes a food story. Farmers around the world do not produce food out of nothing. If fertilizer inputs become scarce or too expensive, then food production gets squeezed globally, then move one level deeper. Helium matters for semiconductor production. Sulfuric acid matters for semiconductor production. Those are not glamorous headlines, but they matter. Disrupt those flows and chip manufacturing starts to feel pressure. And if chip manufacturing feels pressure, then the whole AI story sitting under the American stock market starts to look more fragile. Now, the war is no longer just hitting oil. It is hitting food. It is hitting chips. It is hitting shipping insurance. It is hitting industrial pricing. It is hitting investor psychology. It is hitting the hidden plumbing of the global economy all at once. That is how a regional war becomes a system event. That is how a recession story becomes a depression story. And that is why a ground invasion of Iran is not just a military question. It is a world economy question. JP Morgan has already warned that under a severe escalation path, the world could face an extraordinary oil squeeze in a very short time. Think about how insane that is. The largest bank in the world, talking in time horizons of weeks, not years. So the chain is straightforward. Ground invasion begins. Iran escalates through Hormuz, oil spikes, food gets squeezed, semiconductor supply gets stressed, markets break, the global economy starts sliding toward depression language, and then we reach the deepest layer of all, what happens to the American empire underneath that. Because the American empire is not just soldiers and ships. It is a financial structure, it is a dollar structure, it is an oil structure, The petrodollar arrangement since the 1970s has basically worked like this. Gulf oil is sold in dollars. The world needs oil. Therefore, the world needs dollars. Therefore, the world keeps buying American debt and financing American deficits. America protects the Gulf order. The Gulf order supports the dollar order. The dollar order supports American power. That is the hidden loop. Now ask what happens if a U.S. ground invasion of Iran destabilizes the Gulf itself, who owns huge amounts of American debt: Japan, China, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, India, Europe. And where do Asia and Europe get much of their energy? From the Gulf, from the same GCC states that would become deeply vulnerable if the conflict exploded. If the Gulf energy system becomes unreliable, if Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and the wider Gulf can no longer guarantee the order underneath the petrodollar structure, then debt holders start thinking differently. They start hedging. They start trusting the old system less. They start asking harder questions about dollar exposure. And once that begins, the whole American financial architecture becomes more fragile. The dollar weakens. Borrowing costs rise. The stock market gets hit. The AI bubble, already inflated by cheap money and fantasy, suddenly looks a lot less stable. That is why I keep saying the real story is not just whether America can beat Iran on the battlefield. The real story is whether trying to prove American control through a ground invasion would end up damaging the very system that made American control possible in the first place. Now we get to the strangest part of the argument. What if that is not merely a risk? What if, for one faction around Trump, some version of that is the point? What if they already believe the old American order is dying, too indebted, too financialized, too dependent on protecting everyone else, too hollowed out by outsourcing, too weak at home, too expensive to maintain? What if they are not really trying to save that system anymore? What if they are trying to collapse it faster and replace it with something else? I know that sounds extreme, but follow the logic. If Hormuz closes, if the Gulf becomes unstable, if Middle Eastern energy becomes unreliable, the world still needs oil. The world still needs food. The world still needs fertilizer. Those needs do not disappear. So where does the world turn? North America, the United States has oil. Canada has enormous energy reserves. Mexico matters. Venezuela matters. North America is rich in food, water, energy, and raw materials. If the Middle East becomes less stable, then Europe, Japan, South Korea, India, and even China become more dependent on North American supply. So what if the point is not to preserve the old empire? What if the point is to let the old global order crack and then rebuild America as the fortress at the center of a harsher, more resource-hungry world? This is where Hegseth-esque Greater North America language becomes so important. Why Greenland? Why the Panama Canal? Why pressure on Canada and Mexico? Why Venezuela? Because this is not the language of a country trying to reassure the world that the liberal order will continue forever. This is the language of a country imagining a continental fortress. I call it the technate, a self-sufficient North American block oil, food, water, minerals, manufacturing potential, 2 oceans, a huge internal market, a perimeter designed not to stabilize the world, but to survive the collapse of the old global order better than everybody else. While Europe struggles for energy, while Asia fights over supply, while the Middle East burns, North America sits behind its perimeter and sells stability back to the world at a premium. Now let me be absolutely clear. I am not saying this is good. I am not saying this is moral. I am not saying ordinary people would not pay the price. They absolutely would. I am saying it has an internal logic, and that is why simply saying Trump is an idiot is not enough. A reckless man can still have a theory. A destructive strategy can still be coherent. In fact, some of the most dangerous strategies in history were dangerous precisely because they were coherent. They accepted suffering as the price of transformation. That is why the Russia comparison matters here. Look at what happened after Russia went into Ukraine. Much of the world focused only on the cost, and the costs were real. But another thing happened too. The Russian state used the war to militarize industrial production, adapt its economy, hard internal politics, and restructure itself around a harsher world. Then think about Alexander Duggan's worldview. Let the liberal order collapse. Do not save it. Build a harder civilizational bloc that survives the collapse better than everyone else. What if one faction in Washington has looked at that model and drawn its own lesson? Do not preserve the old order. Use crisis to bury it. Use war to justify a new one. Move from finance back to resources. Move from global empire back to the continent. Move from Pax Americana to Fortress North America. Then the Iran question changes completely. And the question is not just, can America beat Iran? Now the question is whether a war with Iran could be used to accelerate the transition from a global American empire to a harder North American stronghold. And that brings us to the real scenario tree. Scenario 1. America invades Iran. It gets bogged down. Iran stretches the war, Hormuz becomes more dangerous. Oil spikes, food and chip supply get hit, the global economy slides toward depression, America takes a historic strategic defeat in the Middle East. That is the nightmare. If your goal is to preserve the old empire, scenario 2, America invades the war still turns ugly and expensive, the wider world economy still fractures, but North America emerges as the most resource-rich and self-sufficient major region in a deeply unstable world. In that version, America loses the old game and tries to win the resource game that comes after the collapse. Scenario 3. The threat of invasion is itself part of the strategy. The reserve language, the prediction markets, the Pentagon preparation, all of it is used to pressure negotiations, reshape alliances, and prepare Americans psychologically for a much harder, more continental doctrine without ever fully committing to a multi-year occupation. That may be the least irrational path available to them, because a true ground invasion could unleash costs too large for even its supporters to control. But in every scenario, one thing stays the same. The people who pay are the ordinary people, Americans who get sent to fight, Iranians who get bombed, displaced, and buried, families across poorer countries who suddenly cannot afford food, fuel, or fertilizer. That is the tragedy of empire. It is always ordinary people who pay. It is always the powerful who try to convert crisis into advantage. So when someone asks me what happens if the United States invades Iran, my answer is this. First, the military operation becomes far uglier and more expensive than its advocates are admitting. Second, the economic consequences spread far beyond Iran and far beyond America. Third, the deeper issue may not be Iran at all. The deeper issue may be whether one faction in Washington is trying to use this crisis to break the old American empire and replace it with something harder, smaller, more self-sufficient, and more brutal. And that is why this question matters so much, because if America invades Iran, we will not just be watching a war, we will be watching a test of whether the old American order is still being defended, or whether the people who claim to lead that order are now preparing to bury it in the fire and build something else afterwards.